Good afternoon, everybody, and thank you for joining us today for this session of the Institute for National Strategic Studies speaker series in collaboration with the Strategic Multi-Layer Assessment. I'm Michael McClougic, INSS Senior Fellow and the editor of PRISM. Today's speaker is Dr. Paul Krugman, recipient of the Nobel Memorial Prize in Economic Sciences for his work on international trade theory. Dr. Krugman is certainly among the best known economists today. He's taught at Yale, MIT, Stanford, and is currently on the faculty of the City University of New York. And he also writes a weekly column for the New York Times. The topic of today's session is, did globalization go too far? Dr. Krugman notes that on the eve of the pandemic, the world economy was far more closely integrated than ever before, with much of the world's production dependent on complex international supply chains. These supply chains have, however, proven much more vulnerable than expected to both natural and political events. Is it time to simplify the world again? Dr. Krugman will speak for approximately 45 minutes, followed by an audience-driven question and response session. Throughout the session, please submit your questions via Zoom Gov's chat function. Just click the chat icon at the bottom bar of your screen and submit all questions to Mr. Todd Veazey. Dr. Krugman, if you are ready to go, the mic is yours.
Okay. Hi, everybody. I'm Paul Krugman, and sorry that we couldn't do this in person, but that's the world we're in right now. So I'm going to try to give you an overview and not maybe even shave it a little bit, because I think the questions, the discussion is always the most interesting part of these things. I want to talk about how we got to where we are in globalization and some of the issues of the current situation, which it looks, the trends that a lot of people still, I think, are imagining will continue, probably won't. And you'll see what I mean as I go along. So first, let's just talk, a potted history of globalization over the past 40 years or so. So if you go back to circa 1980, where we were in 1980 was that the world trade was actually, somewhat surprisingly, world trade as a share of world GDP was only, it had been growing, but after having been depressed by the two world wars and the protectionism and all of that went on during that period. So by 1980, we were roughly back to an importance of trade in the world economy, roughly the same as we'd had in 1913. We had only more or less regained Edwardian levels of globalization. And a lot of that trade was among advanced countries. My own academic work was largely trying to explain why so much trade took place between countries that seemed similar. What were they trading about? And there's a kind of iron law which says that once you've figured out whenever there's an economic theory that makes sense of the way the world is, the world promptly changes to make that theory less relevant. And so no sooner did we have a really good theory about why trade was dominated by exchanges between countries, advanced countries at similar levels of technology and development, that we had an upsurge in world trade that was between very different countries. So we suddenly had this surge of north-south trade with labor-intensive manufactured goods being purchased from developing countries, and more sophisticated goods on average being sent in return. And along with that, so we in a way, the mystery of why the US and Canada or Germany and France do so much trade became less relevant, because all of us were doing lots and lots of trade with China instead. That led to, or that new form of trade, which included these value chain trade with multiple stages of production spread across multiple national borders, led to a surge in trade. So in 1980, trade was not especially more important than it had been before World War I. By the mid 2000s, we'd had, some people call it hyperglobalization. We'd had this extraordinary expansion of global trade to roughly twice the level as a share of world GDP that it ever had before. That was the iron law applied again, just about the time that people really got their minds wrapped around hyperglobalization and or began extrapolating it, so that we had a lot of academic work on the rise of value chain production, and we had popular books. This is about the time that my colleague Tom Friedman published The World is Flat. That turns out to be exactly the point when that new form of globalization stalled. We didn't go backwards. We haven't had a collapse in trade like the one that took place in the interwar period. But world trade has, by just about every measure, roughly plateaued. And that's not a new development. World trade really kind of hit its max level as a share of world production circa 2007, 2008. It took a while for us to be clear that this was something more than just the effects of the financial crisis. World trade, trade always contracts more than GDP during a slump. And it turned out that that effect was especially severe in 2008 because of the shift to value chain trade. World trade was dominated by durable goods in a way that didn't used to be. And those are the kinds of goods that in a normal recession really plunge. Now, I'll talk in a second about us not having a normal recession this time around, but normally you do expect trade to plunge. But and people did expect that trade would recover, which it did as we emerged from the financial crisis, but it recovered roughly back to its level on the eve of the crisis and did not surpass it. So we are now, this is not a short-term thing. We're now almost 15 years of plateaued globalization, not a surging global economy, but one in which the degree of integration of world economies has been more or less flat. That's a high degree of integration by historical standards, but it's not, as far as we can tell, really increasing. Why, really two questions. Why did we have this surge in world trade? And why did it plateau? So there's a tendency, it's often the case that people fall into a kind of technological determinism, believing that the technology of transportation and communication dictates how much world trade we're going to have, and also that the trend in that is always upwards. So both of which are wrong. It's not the case that the volume of world trade is ineluctable. It's very much sensitive to policy decisions, and which is what we saw during the interwar period when rising protectionism really knocked globalization back a long ways. And it's also, even on the technological side, it's not ineluctable. Simply having technological progress in transportation and communication doesn't necessarily mean more trade, because there's always a race between the technology of transportation and the technology of production. Think of it as you have the choice between producing a good domestically or importing it from an overseas source where, let's say, labor costs are lower. If the technology, think of it in modern terms, though it wasn't always this way. If automation makes labor costs less relevant, then you may choose to return production to a domestic source rather than import. So it's only if technological progress is faster in transportation and communication than it is in domestic production that you expect to see rising globalization. And that has happened in a couple of eras. There was basically the steamship and telegraph era, which led to the first global economy. There's the containerization and internet era, which did a lot for the second era, but it's not not always the case. And if you look at stories now about, there's more anecdotal evidence than hard data, but there certainly have been stories about companies retreating somewhat from global supply chains. And one thing you often hear is, well, we have robots, or we have ways of automating so that the higher labor costs of producing something in Europe or the United States are less important relative to labor costs in China, given the fact that we aren't using as much labor as we had to before. But there were enabling technologies. You couldn't have had all of this supply chain stuff without containerization. It's actually interesting when you look, the evidence that containerization lowered freight costs it's there, but it's weaker than you might expect. There's not as much of a reduction in measurable freight costs, but what there was a tremendous improvement in logistical quality. Basically, having a sealed container with a barcode, so you knew what was in it, made it possible to have these global production chains in a way that wasn't possible before. It just keeping track of stuff turned out to be a really big thing. And also the intermodal from ships onto trucks and railroads and back again made a big difference. One of the things doesn't get emphasized very much, but the extent to which global trade used to be inhibited by pilferage at the docks was significant, and containers don't completely eliminate that, but reduced it. But that was an enabling factor. And widespread containerization actually preceded by a number of years the real takeoff of globalization. So what really brought it on, it was a necessary condition, was the technology. But the sort of sufficient condition was changed policy. Not so much in advanced countries. We tend to have certainly in the US, we tend to have a US-centric view. We think that what matters is what we do, and we don't treat other countries as actors. And just more generally, the OECD, the advanced countries, tend to think of themselves as being the prime movers. But there wasn't that much of a change in advanced country trade policy from the mid-1980s onwards. What there was a huge change in policy in developing countries. The most spectacular being, of course, China becoming part of the world. And that's just by itself an enormous change. But outside China, there was a tremendous shift in strategy. In the early 1980s, most of the developing world was still following inward-looking policies of import substituting industrialization. And then that was radically changed. Radical reductions in tariffs, elimination of import quotas. And it's a basic proposition of international trade theory that import restrictions are actually export restrictions too. That if you go inward looking, you export less as well as importing less. And so the fact that you had really major changes in trade policy in the developing world basically put the developing world in a position to start taking advantage of the possibilities that had already been created by the new technology of transportation. And so you can see that there's actually been a recent study of Taiwan, which was the first economy really to make this switch. And it was ideas. There's a lot more just plain intellectual persuasion involved. Mexico made its big transition. NAFTA was actually almost an afterthought. The big transition in Mexico was between 85 and 88, when Mexico just completely revamped its trade strategy. India a little bit later, and so on. So this change in policy was the crucial step in leading us to this value-added, very high levels of integration global economy. What has stalled? Why did it seem to reach a limit around 2007 or 2008? One reason is simply this was a one-time thing. You had a better technologies, change in policy, so you get a big change in the way that the world does business. And once we'd exploited that, you wouldn't expect world trade to continue to grow at the same rates it had grown before. But there were also, even before the financial crisis of 2008, and even before certainly before the pandemic, you were starting to get, again, anecdotal evidence, but it kind of fits what you see in the trade numbers, a sense that companies had overstretched, that the logistics, that to save a few pennies on labor cost, they had created long, vulnerable supply chains, and that there were some advantages to paying a little bit more for production, but being closer to the markets and being able to adjust to market conditions more quickly. And so you were starting to see probably a fair bit of just companies realizing that they had overstretched just in purely market terms, that they, even without extraordinary events, that we had gone a little bit too far in globalization. And so that was something that was already coming into play more than a decade ago as a restraint on globalization. Couple of further events then follow. So let me say a word about the pandemic and then other issues. So the pandemic, your first thought would be, my God, we're afraid to basically to go outdoors, so and that must have a negative effect on globalization. In a direct sense, not so much. Shipping containers are not disease vectors, and the movement of goods is not actually in itself a problem. There were some, and continue to be some, disruptions because port operations have been disrupted by outbreaks of COVID-19. But for the most part, the physical business of moving goods has been robust to the pandemic. If you ask, well, what about all of those shortages? And what about the shipping container crunch? Which I have to say, that is something very few of us saw coming. That is, in fact, it's an odd thing, because on the one hand, you're hearing all of this stuff about the shortage of shipping containers, and on the other hand, the volume of world trade has actually held up quite strongly. There was a very brief dip, and then it's actually, if anything, a little bit higher than pre-pandemic. And that is actually, in a way, why it's one of the main reasons we have a crunch at port facilities and at shipping containers. As I mentioned, in a normal recession, world trade falls a lot more than world output, because demand for durable goods falls more than demand in general, and durable goods are what we mostly trade. In this very, very peculiar economic episode, demand for durable goods has actually risen a lot, whilst demand for services, which is normally fairly stable, has fallen. And that's because consumption of face-to-face services is a disease vector. And so, if the caricature, but it actually gets at a lot of the truth, is people buying Pelotons because they can't go to the gym. I'd love to have a less elite sounding example, but that's certainly something that things like that happened quite a lot. And of course, Pelotons are shipped internationally. It's basically an Asian product. So you had an increased demand for shipping, and that's an important part of why we have the stall. It also turns out to be the case that at extreme levels of demand for global shipping, you start to have something which is kind of like if when traffic on a highway exceeds a certain level, the carrying capacity of the highway actually starts to go down. There's so much traffic congestion that the number of vehicles that can pass, that pass a given point per hour actually falls. And there's a bit of that you have so many ships steaming back and forth in front of the port of Los Angeles, waiting for a chance to unload, that they're tying up a bunch of the shipping containers that we need to ship stuff. So we've had this. The pandemic has created a crunch, but in fact has not directly been a negative impact on world trade. There's a there are some longer term issues. Actually, I'm going to hold those for a second and talk about the longer term issues, given what happened during the pandemic. Let me just talk for a little bit about the other thing that we, before the pandemic, that we were talking about as a possible restraint on international trade, and that's economic nationalism. And I know some people are going to want to talk about this, national security related aspects as well. So obviously we had the United States made at least, well, rhetorically and to some extent in terms of actual policy, made a hard turn away from its previous advocacy for an increasingly liberal world economy. The United States imposed a set of tariffs during the Trump years, which have not come off. So we're still in that position. So we made a turn towards economic nationalism. The impact on trade is real, but fairly limited. The tariffs, it's a really significant increase on the average tariff on Chinese goods. But China, even now, even in this world, is only a part of US trade. And though we did impose some tariffs on other countries, it's not nearly as large. Overall tariff rate went up by a couple of percentage points of value, which is significant, but not huge. So in a direct sense, we probably didn't have that much of a direct protectionist negative effect on trade, but we had a definite change in psychology. The United States basically, okay, actually what I should say is, what were the roots of that protectionist shift? And on the one hand, there was a narrative that a lot of people wanted to give, which was that there's a populist backlash against globalization, and that was what was driving it. It's actually not at all clear how much that was really going on. There was never really deep public support for the Trump era tariffs. They just did not have a mass base. I think not so much that people were against them as the people just didn't care much. And in general, if you ask, polling on do you think free trade is a good idea, it actually moved in a pro-free trade direction during that period. It wasn't. It was not the case that there was a mass movement demanding protectionism. To a large extent, the specific tariffs that were applied under the previous president were personal. It was what he wanted. And given the way that the US trade policy system works, the president has an extraordinary amount of leeway to impose tariffs if he chooses. So this was really an individual choice. And it was one of those things where people trying to model what the future of tariffs would be, where it came down to, well, you're trying to model basically the mind of one man. And that wasn't a very helpful approach. We didn't know what to do there. That said, I think we can say that the kind of noblesse oblige aspect of US trade policy it had actually eroded before Trump. We have a long tradition in the United States of being the prime promoters of a more open world trading system, which was viewed as a national security policy, viewed as a policy to make the world a safer place. It goes back to Cordell Hull under FDR, believing that enhanced international trade links are good for world peace. And that was a psychology that just eroded. It's just not a popular position at this point. Not so much that we have a widespread populist protectionist movement as that we just don't have the kind of support for the US playing that role anymore. Partly reflecting some of the downsides of globalization, but partly just reflecting, I think, the fact that the United States is no longer a dominant economic superpower in the way it used to be, and not prepared to play that role. What all of this, what the economic nationalism does, is economic nationalism in the United States, to some extent. Brexit is a whole other story. Maybe people want to ask about that. What it does is not so much the concrete trade barriers. When we look at one thing, when we talk about Brexit and Britain leaving the European Union, while there are a lot of frictions, there are not going to be high tariffs against vis-a-vis Europe. But there are frictions that weren't there. There's a lot of ease of movement that you have when you're part of a customs union that you lose when you're not. But on the other hand, Canada, we have a free trade agreement with Canada, but not a customs union. We don't have a common external tariff. You do have to do invoicing and rules of origin, which is not enough. That there are significant border effects vis-a-vis Canada on trade, but it's not enough to prevent a lot of integration. It's not enough to prevent Detroit, Windsor from being considered a single metropolitan area, even though it has an international boundary running right through the middle of it. So it's not a huge thing, but all of this creates, from the point of view of businesses, an extra layer of uncertainty, which sort of reinforces the skepticism about long international supply chains that was probably already inhibiting globalization even before the pandemic hit. Then you have the pandemic with all of the attendant disruptions. What we don't know, almost surely I guess we kind of expected that we were going to be able to resume sort of normal travel and activity by now, which has turned out not to be the case, not yet. Presumably at some point by next year we'll be there, gotta hope. How much does that inhibit globalization? It turns out that, well, okay, the answer is that we don't know, because the medium run may be quite different from the short run. In the short run, you don't need physical mobility of people that much to conduct trade in goods. You can, again, the trade in goods itself doesn't require, it isn't a disease vector, and with modern communication, you can continue to stay in pretty close touch with between suppliers and customers, despite not having people flying out there on a regular basis. What we don't know is how much you're relying upon already established relationships, and how much to the extent that over time, not being able to create those relationships is going to be an inhibition on global trade. One of the things that I've tried to look at for some indication, I don't know if people know, one of the really one of the empirical relationships that works really well in international trade is the gravity model, which says that the amount of trade between two countries is proportional to the product of their GDPs and inversely related to distance. That fits alarmingly well in the data, and the distance. The puzzling thing is that the distance coefficient is much larger than you can explain based upon measurable transport costs. It doesn't really cost all that much more to ship things 8,000 miles than 2,000 miles, but the ability to have the vice president for production quality fly over for a quick meeting does diminish quite a lot with that distance. And so there's some reason to believe that the personal interaction, maybe not immediately, but over time, does matter quite a lot. So there's some reason for to believe that we will see, unless we go back to feeling at ease with lots of airplane travel in particular, that we'll be seeing some erosion of global trade. Looking forward, two things I think we really want to think about. The uncertainties associated with nationalism, and the risks. The fact of the matter that the fact that now, we know that countries may impose import restrictions, but also export restrictions. That in times of crisis, you can't necessarily count on supplies that are based on remote locations being available. That has to have an effect on business planning, and should probably have some effect on government policy. So it is a little bit alarming, has been a bit alarming during all of this, that we are so reliant for a lot of critical stuff on countries, places that we don't fully trust. And again, the kind of US-centric or OECD-centric view of the world may be missing a lot. We talk a lot, we went on endlessly about a US administration that turned its back on a lot of the traditions of US support for openness and a liberal global economy. But what about other countries? What about China? I'm sure that almost everybody in this audience knows more about what's happening in China than I do. But if you have a government that appears to be becoming more authoritarian and nationalist than it was, that appears to be less willing to sort of say to get rich is glorious and business should do whatever it finds profitable, and more willing to intervene politically, we don't know if that will lead to disruptions of trade, but it might. And the fact that it might is something that both corporations should take into account, and probably the US government should take into account as well, that there is a case for some self-sufficiency out there. There is so that's a negative looking forward on globalization. A positive for globalization, which is something I've been thinking about quite a lot lately, is that globalization, the big globalization that took hyperglobalization, was overwhelmingly a story of goods trade. It really is. It's the supply chain. It's this thing, which is, where is this manufactured? And the answer is, well, that's a complicated story. Last stop is China, but it's got components from all over the world. That kind of globalization has probably plateaued and might retreat some, given the considerations that I've mentioned. Um, but we've had for quite a long time now people predicting a real upsurge in intangible trade, trade in services. And there's more of that than there used to be, but not nearly as much as quite a thought. I've gone back and read some of the papers that from the mid 2000s about how many jobs were now at risk of outsourcing because with digital technology they can be done from anywhere. And some of that happened, but not nearly as much as people thought might happen. It's still been we're still a world in which trade, for the most part, is trade in goods, but we've now had a period when we've been more or less forced into doing a lot of remote work, and the and it from actually I tend to use the phrase we've had infant industry protection for remote work. Those of you, and again, many people know the infant industry theory was that countries should temporarily protect their manufacturing from foreign competition until it acquires the know-how and the competence to stand on its own feet, which is certainly does happen sometimes, been much abused as a policy tool. But the idea that you have technologies, know-how that doesn't get acquired as long as there's a routine, well-established alternative, but that given a disruption, people will turn to it and then in the end discover that it was worth doing, that they now know how to do it on a sustained basis. That's still an idea that makes sense. And we've had massive infant industry protection accidentally for work, remote work, communication, Zoom and its competitors. And it has likely led to a permanent shift in the way we work. Not everything. I mean, we all, I have a very limited piece of the world in my personal experience, but I can tell you that graduate seminars are, if you ask me, are better on Zoom because I can see everybody, and it's actually the participation level, I think, goes up, particularly among the shyer students. But that lectures, which of course I'm kind of doing right now, but lectures are really bad because I can't see you all. I can't read the room, and there's a lot more feedback involved in doing an effective large class than you might imagine. So it's selective. Some things work, and that's true of business as well. Business people I talk to say that certain things have turned out to work really well, and certain other things are not. They're not necessarily what you would expect, but there will be a class of stuff that can be done remote. And once it can be done remote, it can be done internationally. So there's really a possibility. I mean, we had certain small area call centers where this thing kind of started, but now the possibility of a lot of things being done at really long distance is there. And I believe once the dust has settled, we'll probably find out that globalization of certain kinds of services has actually made a major uptick. The globalization of goods may actually be in retreat at least a little bit, but the globalization of services will have expanded quite a lot. How should we think about the national interest? Actually, global interest as well, but how should we think about how these things change the situation? So, as I said, and I'm sure we're going to have quite a lot of discussion about this shortly, there are definite national security concerns now that we know that globalization can be disrupted, that the world doesn't always get flatter, and in particular that political decisions can make it less flat. There is a valid concern of being dependent, interestingly not so much dependent for markets as for supply on remote locations. This has always been, it's always been recognized under trade law. There's there's a national security article in the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade. There's Section 232 in U.S. trade law, which is more or less designed to be congruent with that national security clause. It needs to be used appropriately. We had some outrages. The idea that steel from Canada poses a U.S. national security threat was almost custom designed to make the national security argument less credible, but dependent for rare earths or crucial chips on not necessarily friendly foreign suppliers is a real national security issue. And so there is, yes, a case for probably tariffs are, almost always tariffs are a second best policy at best. The case for national policies to ensure at least a basic level of self-sufficiency, or at least reliance upon reliably friendly nations. That case is definitely there. Should we be worried about the implications, however, of some kind of retreat, even if it's only a partial one, from globalization? So if you want to, the history, how did the US become a champion of globalization? The World Trade System is largely something that the US created in its own image. And it has its origins in the 30s with FDR and the Trade Agreements Program, which was partly designed to find a graceful, politically feasible way of stepping back from extreme protectionism, from how to unravel Smoot-Hawley in a way that could be sold as job creation. But it was also very much conceived of as something that would enhance US national security and just in general make the world a more friendly place. And the idea was, again, that Cordell Hull, FDR Secretary of State, arguing that free trade was or increased trade at any rate was helped to promote world peace. It's always been a little bit questionable, but there was something to it. If you go back to the origins of the European Union, began with the coal and steel community, which was basically designed to make the French and German coal and steel industries so interdependent that a future war would be largely impossible economically. We've continued that strategy to some degree up to the present day, and it does have its positives. If I would say in particular, if you ask, if we are to some extent retreating from globalization, who do I worry about? Not the United States that much. We're still, despite everything, not that open an economy. In particular, if NAFTA, I guess we're supposed to call it the USMCA. Anyway, the son of NAFTA or something like it remains in effect, then we certainly do a lot of trade with the outside world, but it's not that much, and we're certainly given time to adjust. We're capable of doing fine. We would pay a cost for a less liberal world trading system, but it's not going to be huge. The same is true for the European Union. The same is true actually even for China, which is now such a big player that it's less dependent on global trade than it was, and could survive in a more protectionist world. But it's smaller, poorer countries that are outside these blocks that you worry about. If I look for the places where globalization has really delivered on its promise, It would be not the United States, not the cheap stuff on Walmart at Walmart or on Amazon, but it would be places like Bangladesh, which is still a desperately poor country, but about 3 times as rich as it used to be, has gone from being a country really on the verge of Malthusian crisis to a country that is still very poor, but quite a ways above that level. And it's all made possible. The places where globalization has been really crucial has been poor countries that have managed to climb some ways up the ladder based on exports. In the case of Bangladesh, as people say, it's not a banana republic, it's a pajama republic. Without that, they would have no chance really. So sorry, let's see if I can just kill this. Sorry, this is one of the risks of remote work. Anyway, so a world with fewer opportunities, with less open markets, would become a world with fewer opportunities for countries to make their way in the world, and probably as a result, a less safe world. And so that, while globalization creates, we now realize, some national security threats, too big of a retreat from globalization could also create a different kind of threat by creating vulnerability, by basically reducing the opportunities for countries that need access to world markets to bring themselves up in the world. And that would be a significant negative. So where would I go now? I think we need to no more. We're not going to go back to big trade agreements. I think it's just not a possible. There would be a case for it, actually, if you actually ask. When we were talking about TPP, I was a soft opponent, mostly because I thought the domestic political cost was too high, and I wasn't all that persuaded of the economics. But I got sort of yelled at by some very senior administration officials, and it was all about geopolitics. They didn't even really try to defend the economics as being great. They just argued that the geopolitics was really important, and there is something to that, but it's just not, the appetite for such deals is just not there. And we probably do need some form of industrial policy aimed at creating more self-sufficiency in critical areas. And beyond that, we just have to try to manage the era of hyperglobalization is behind us. We're not going to be seeing a comparable surge, and we might be seeing a small erosion in the integration of the world economy, but that's okay, provided that we manage to avoid really destroying the economic prospects of countries that really need access to world markets, and manage to deal with our problems, our domestic problems, which in the end are always the thing that matters most. And I'm actually going to, that's a bit short of my 45 minutes, but I'm actually going to bring this to a close, because I think it'd be much more interesting to deal with questions than for me to continue pontificating. So let's have at it.
Well, thank you very much, Professor. And there are a number of questions. One question from the Institute for National Strategic Studies is based on the idea that globalization was meant to bring us all together into a single global market. Today, you hear a lot, or at least you used to hear a lot, about decoupling, particularly our supply chains from China. What are your thoughts on decoupling? Is it possible? Would it be a good thing? What would be the ramifications of decoupling from the Chinese economy?
I think it makes sense. I mean, complete decoupling is probably would be expensive, and would require a pretty heavy-handed level of intervention. But partial decoupling, I have to say, given the world we're living in, given and given again, I'm really reluctant because what do I know? But China is it's not a lovable regime. Let's put it that way, and it's a very nationalistic regime. And when I read, particularly on some of the supply chain issues, where people will say, look, at this point, we just don't have the industrial ecosystem to produce some of the things that we are now reliant, that we now rely on China to produce. You don't have to be a hardline economic nationalist to be kind of disturbed about that. And so, and all out, let's not trade with China, obviously not. But to say that we probably want to be a little bit more able to do things for ourselves, or have them done, in allied democracies. I don't think it's America versus the world, but there is a situation where a significant amount of decoupling would make some sense. I have to say, when I look at corporations that have really put all of their eggs in the China basket, block that metaphor, I wonder whether, are they really thinking about the possible ramifications? It may be a low probability event that we get to a situation where there's a real blockade situation vis-a-vis China, but it's not a super low probability event, and it's something you should be concerned about.
Thank you, Professor. Could you go back to something you said earlier about possibly a little bit of industrial policy might be necessary? That term used to be neuralgic, at least in Washington. The idea of industrial policy was just off the table. You hear a little bit more about it these days. What are your thoughts about what kind of industrial policy and how we might be able to manage that?
Okay. Clearly, the kind of industrial policy that people used to talk about in the 80s, which was really heavy government intervention in the direction of the economy, it still doesn't look like a good idea. But government support for R&D, government support for tax credits for strategic sectors, the case for that looks, I'd say, substantially better than we used to think. I think once we get away from, there were some, if we can avoid the really kind of crude stuff, and we used to say, people saying we should target sectors with high value added per worker. No, that's not a good criterion. But sectors where there's a reasonable chance that there are important technological spillovers, and sectors that, again, look possibly crucial for national security, that looks like a better case. I'd say the case for that looks better than it did before. In fact, one of the things that, so maybe an odd thing to bring into a discussion of globalization, but we have had what looks to me like a really big success story for industrial policy these past dozen years that's gone largely unheralded, which is in the energy sector. As part of the much maligned 2009 stimulus bill, the U.S. Provided substantial financial incentives for renewable energy, and it worked. We've seen a dramatic fall in the cost of solar and wind, which is not entirely due to U.S. policy, but actually the solar, a lot of it probably is U.S. policy that provided crucial market scale, and wind, actually a lot of that is European industrial policy to provide crucial scale. And that's kind of an object lesson in how an industrial policy can work. Again, you don't want to cross the board. We don't historically, when people call for across the board industrial policy, they almost always end up getting it wrong and favoring the existing large sectors that are not where you should be going. But if you look at, this is not going to be political here, but if you look at the kinds of things that are in the if it happens, the proposed Democratic Reconciliation Bill, which is standards, clean energy standards that are designed to foster innovation, tax credits, limited subsidies, and a fair bit of direct public sector R&D in what we hope are going to be sectors that will pan out. That's something that does now look really quite reasonable. So, industrial policy that involves spending, taking over a third of private investment is not something, but something that involves spending through tax credits and subsidies and directed R&D, 1% of GDP. There's a pretty good case for doing that.
Thank you, sir. We have a question from, question is from Curtis. How do you project a demographic and therefore consumer power decline in both Europe and China will drive US trade policy? Are these trends likely to make the US more trade protectionist or likely to encourage the US to embrace the increased specialization available through global supply chains?
Oh, wow. Okay. So I'm not sure exactly what the questioner meant by demographics, but there's a kind of there's a macroeconomic background to all of this stuff that is that the decline of working age population is a phenomenon that started in Japan, but has now reached Europe and China, rather remarkably. And what all of that does, when secular stagnation, sorry, the jargon phrase, hard to think of a phrase that is less evocative of what it really means. But anyway, if you have an end to growth of the working age population, that depresses investment demand. You don't need to keep on building new office buildings, shopping malls, houses, because the population is falling, not rising, which tends to lead to a savings glut. And other things equal, tends to lead to low interest rates, weak currencies, and trade surpluses on the part of countries experiencing that transition. And that could be a problem if the US was, we already are to some extent the world's consumer of last resort, and if that became an even bigger issue, that could become a source of tensions. However, turns out that we are also experiencing the same demographic thing, a little bit behind, but not much. US prime age adult population has been flat since 2008. We're no longer, we are ourselves. It's basically, this thing hit Japan first, then Europe, and is now hitting us. We're also in this demographic transition, which creates a lot of problems for macroeconomic policy. It means that the R star, the equilibrium interest rate that consistent with full employment is negative in real terms, and monetary policy has a hard time maintaining full employment. So our problem is not really so much that the demography abroad as demography everywhere is now not very favorable to macroeconomic stabilization. There's an answer to that, or at least one answer, is increased public investment, which is there's even aside from the fact that we need a fair bit of infrastructure and so on, it's also in some ways we want the public sector to do the spending that the private sector. Basically, we're a world that's awash in savings, all dressed up with nowhere to go. and having the public sector put some of those savings to use is something that could help on both in its direct payoff and also by helping us maintain full employment. And the low interest rates that we have mean that we really don't need to be very concerned about debt at this point. Now, if we are going to have that, that also means that we have a vehicle for industrial policy. Public spending is going to make decisions about what we're spending on. And so it's actually kind of a natural fit for us to be, to some extent, I mean, obviously things like repairing sewers is not about national security. It's about maintaining a drinkable water, but a fair bit of stuff is going to be on both climate related, but also national security related infrastructure spending. And so this kind of stuff all dovetails together. But no, the demographic transition is a huge issue. I mean, there's a lot of, there's shrinking populations there are some good things to be said about that. It's a burden on the environment, but how to maintain macroeconomic stability when your working age population is declining is a big problem, and it's one that we all share. Basically, we have all turned into Japan at this point.
Thank you, sir. Next question is from Larry Kuznar. Your point about the diminished effect of the pandemic on trade in goods and technology, enabling communication, are well taken. Was globalism necessary to international efforts to generate vaccines? Might globalization be resilient to a degree and more important for our well-being than ever?
Yeah, actually, the vaccine story is interesting because it's two things about the vaccine trade. So back up. There was traditional trade theory. I'm sorry, I'm going to approach this first from the point of view of a trade theorist and then related to events. There was a traditional trade theory, David Ricardo, Cloth and Wine, which was about countries trading to take advantage of their differences. Then there was new trade theory, quote unquote, which was, or as people now say, the old new trade theory, which is the kind of stuff that I worked on when I was young, which was about similar countries trading largely to take advantage of economies of scale, large scale production, and trade between advanced countries being a large part of it. And then there's the hyperglobalization, which is back to kind of the old-fashioned countries are different, with this vastly enhanced scope for trade because of the ability to have vertically fragmented international value chains. The vaccine trade, the miracle of the new vaccines, but in general, pharma trade is actually that old new trade theory type of trade. For the most part, the vaccines, the ingredients are produced in advanced countries. There's a few production facilities elsewhere, but they're produced in advanced countries. There's a large amount of trade because there are very large economies of scale. So you tend to have there's been a little bit more diversification, but an awful lot of, as I understand it, I'm trying desperately to get up to speed on this, but an awful lot of the lipids that are used in the mRNA stuff is coming from the UK. And you ask us, is there something special about Britain that makes them good at lipids? Probably not. There are just big economies of scale, and Britain is where the stuff happened to be concentrated. So this is, and because it's among advanced countries, actually most of these security issues don't have much less force. These are democratic advanced nations, and I think that we still mostly trust each other on this. And the other odd thing, talking about all of the shipping and all of these concerns, pharma products are by and large shipped by air. It's an interesting thing. In terms of tonnage, only a tiny fraction of world trade goes by air. In terms of value, it's about 30% of world trade goes by air because it's the very high value products, high value per weight that get shipped by air, and pharma is definitely part of that. So all of these issues that we're seeing with container ships, stranded at sea, and all of that, and all of the issues about north-south trade and did the supply chains get too long, don't really apply. Pharma is airplanes carrying stuff between advanced countries. And as far as I can make out, that's almost entirely a positive. There are very few reasons to be concerned about that. There is a question about getting enough vaccines to the developing world, but if we're going to have a pretty benign globalization that is not much disrupted by the things that have been happening, it turns out that the vaccine trade is one of the good parts. Vaccine trade has been a bright spot in all of this.
Thank you, Professor. The next question is from Scott Tousley. And he asks, is China the ultimate winner in a world with a leveling off of international trade?
No. So first of all, the idea that there are winners and losers from trade is mostly wrong. I mean, it's not. Your country is my competitor, but it's also my market, and it's not the idea that it's anything like a zero-sum game is probably not right. And China, if anything, I would say China is probably on balance a little bit of a loser because China it's an economic superpower, and it's diversified, and it's much more capable of sophisticated production that used to be. It's not a low income, low technology country anymore, but it is lower. It's still not on the level of the United States or Western Europe. Basically, given time, we've allowed ourselves to lose some of our industrial infrastructure, but in terms of fundamental competence, anything China can produce, we could produce here. That's not entirely true in reverse. And I don't know how danger of taking an anecdote and blowing it up too much, but it does not appear that the Chinese vaccine is nearly as effective as the Western vaccines have been, and that may be just an accident, but it's the kind of thing you'd expect to see. That fundamentally, even now, in spite of all of that incredible progress that the Chinese have made, they're not on the same level. So a world in which globalization is eroded is a world where China is probably less well equipped to deal with it than we are. Although the real losers, again, are going to be the poorer countries. So China will manage. It may be hurt some, probably we would be hurt some, but not as much. But you really want to worry about Vietnam and Bangladesh and the smaller players out there, and of course, and Africa, which is just beginning to get into this game. It would be a real shame if we shut down the options before a large part of humanity even starts to get in on the upside. Michael, the most used phrase, and yeah, you're still muted.
A question from G.K. Allen Jr. from the Joint Staff. Do you think that we should have a free world trade industrial policy made for our collective security, where we work without allies and partners? It looks like it should be where we work with allies and partners to compete against China.
Yeah, I mean, if we can do it. I mean, I'm fundamentally, and this is take off my economist hat, just I still believe in the great democratic alliance that the that at a fundamental level, uh, um, Western Europe, of course, Canada, and Japan and Korea are all at a fundamental values level. I think we still have a great deal in common. I mean, in terms of the world trade system, someplace where that was a little bit um, closer to something I really know something about. We were on the eve of some of the political turmoil of the past 5-6 years. We were evolving towards a world trade system. I mean, the U.S. hasn't been the global trade hegemon for quite a while, but we were evolving towards a kind of relatively benign system where the U.S. and the European Union were co-hegemons, and we can work together because in the whatever disputes we may have at a fundamental level, the fundamental values, I think, Western Europe and the United States share. And so in terms of strategic stuff, that would be a strategic investment, strategic industrial policy. If we can do that, now there's a problem. The European Union has in some ways been a disappointment. We had hoped that they'd be closer to being a cohesive body than they've turned out to be, but not that they're still there. We can get on the phone with Macron or whoever is Merkel's successor in ways that we can't with a lot of the world. So yes, and the vaccine story is again, it is in effect, there have been some hiccups and a bit of nationalism and some ill will, but at a basic level, what's actually happened is that the world's advanced countries have managed to collectively produce an epidemiological and technological miracle.
Thank you, sir. There's a follow-on question to that, and it's sort of moving from an area that you know more about to an area that all of us are trying to understand a little bit better. The question is anonymous. What are your thoughts about the strength and durability of the rules-based liberal world order, long promoted and nurtured by the West? Is the model under strain? What might be done to strengthen it in a 2.0 version?
Well, this is actually something we worry about a lot. And when I say that the World Trade System was created in the U.S. image, we created a rule-based, legalistic kind of system, very very American. It's there's a law, and there are and the fine print determines what you can and can't do, and that worked. Fundamentally, it worked extremely well for 70 years as a way of producing both. I always describe the world trading system as levers and ratchets. The levers are the negotiating rounds that move the system forward. The ratchets are the rules that prevent backsliding, and it worked really well for a long time. We want to keep as much of that as we can, but it is true that it is harder, and we probably have to rely a lot more on judgment and intent and less on formal rules based. And I'm not sure how that works. I'll give you a very specific example. If we're going to do climate policy, I mean, climate policy it's a national security issue among everything else, but if we're going to do serious climate policy, which I hope to God we're going to, if climate policy were going to take the form of carbon tariffs. Carbon taxes. If it was going to be a simple tax-based price incentives, then we knew how to do that. It was reasonably clear that carbon tariffs would be GATT legal, that we could actually handle the international ramifications by using the same logic that we use to have border adjustments on value-added taxes. And that would have been a pretty straightforward thing. But it doesn't look like that's how we're going to do it. It looks like what we're actually going to do, if we do get effective climate policy in the United States, which is something we'll find out in a few months, it's going to take the place largely of regulations, subsidies, tax credits. And then we're still going to need some kind of border adjustments. You don't want all of the high global greenhouse gas emission stuff to move to countries that have lax rules. But it's going to be you're going to have to do something. You're going to have border adjustments that are kind of a carbon tax equivalent, which is going to be much more model-based and much more judgment-based than the past. So we're going to have to do something. There may be ways to do this. I mean, I think I work in various fields and I see lots of parallels. How did I think we've actually done a fairly decent job at shoring up the financial system after the 2008 crisis. And we used to have a set of quite mechanical rules for banks designed to ensure security. And then we had the problem of financial institutions that don't fit the standard definition of a bank, and to which you can't apply the same rules. But we actually have moved to a system of enhanced capital and other requirements for strategically important institutions. And how do we define a strategically important institution? Well, the actual answer is we apply a pornography standard. We know when we see one, and we have an interagency group that makes those determinations. And so far, they appear to have done a pretty decent job, and it works. So I think the answer is the system 2.0, as the questioner asked, is not going to be as mechanical a rules-based system as the one we used to have. Unfortunately, it doesn't look like the world is going to work that way. But we can try to have something which is a lot less, is not entirely arbitrary either, and we need to try and get one.
Okay, Professor. The next question I have, actually, to save time, I'm going to graft two questions together. The first is from my colleague Frank Hoffman from the Institute for National Strategic Studies, who asks, by the way, hi Frank, great to see you here. Frank asks, does debt matter? You suggested that low interest rates reduce the carrying cost of higher debt, but obviously the level of debt remains high in historical terms. Does the debt principal not have to be paid, or are we passing the buck to the next generation and reducing their options at our own expense? To be followed up by a question from Brian F. related, do you see the national debt and consumer debt being a major concern? With interest rates so low, I don't know what other levers the government has to pull for the next crisis.
Okay, so I'm very much debt doesn't matter, or it's just way down the list of concerns. I think we need to. First of all, does the principal have to be repaid? No. How did we pay off the debt from World War II? We didn't. Debt in 1960 was about the same as debt at the end of the war, but had dwindled to a far smaller share of GDP because of a little bit of inflation and a lot of growth. And so government debt never does need to be repaid. And by the way, I really, the framing of debt being something that we pass on to the next generation is really, it's not totally wrong, but it's misleading in important ways. Remember that the debt is it's not owed to some external creditor. And debt is a claim of one part of the population, the people who own the debt, on another part of the population, which is the taxpayers. It's not really, debt is when nothing makes my correspondents more angrier than when I say this, but it's true. The debt is money that we owe to ourselves. So it's an intergenerational claim, and it's not an intergenerational claim. It's a claim within a generation. It's an interpersonal claim that we create, and it doesn't impoverish the nation. It just means that we have to find a way of making sure that we honor our promises to part of the population, which is not actually very hard when you have extremely low interest rates. I don't even want, modern monetary theory is very fashionable and actually not at all helpful. It's one of those, the old line that's there's stuff that's new and there's stuff that's true, but the stuff that's new isn't true and the stuff that's true isn't new. But the kind of antecedent of it, which is functional finance, which says that you should worry about whether the government is spending more resources than society has, and you should maybe worry a little bit about the level of taxation needed to pay for debt service, but the level of the debt per se is not something to be concerned about. I can think of a few. That's not exactly true. That there are some technical issues, but for the most part, the level of the debt just doesn't matter. The U.S. government, the Office of Management and Budget, has now introduced a new line into its basic budget forecasts, where it includes real net interest payments. So just doing the obvious thing to correct for inflation, and real net interest payments are negative at the moment for the U.S. government. We have a lot of debt out there, but once you adjust for inflation, and even more if you ask what it would take to keep debt stable as a share of GDP, it costs us less than nothing to service that debt. So you really have to work very, very hard. People who want to see us having a debt crisis of some kind have to go through a lot of intellectual somersaults and contortions to tell a story about how that can even happen. So basically, I'm not entirely relaxed about debt, but it wouldn't make my list of top 20 things to be concerned about.
I'll have to remember that our debt is our debt to ourselves.
When it really does.
Well, I'll remind my creditors of that when they come calling.
Well, that's the thing. The nation, a nation is not an individual, and that's the important point.
Understood. Just one last question, and it is I know it's not your specialty, but it's something that you might be interested in, and it's about cryptocurrencies. Let me find the question here. Well, it's basically, I can't find the question on my list here, but the question was about what is the impact of cryptocurrencies? Does it disempower or empower the United States specifically, governments in general, and should we be encouraging their development?
Oh, wow. So I'm part of there's an informal discussion group that meets every few weeks, which is a mixture of Wall Street economists, academics, and we try to, actually in better times we would meet over steak dinners and drink a lot of wine, but these days we're doing it virtually, and we've tried a couple of crypto dinners where we try to bring in interesting people, and the question we keep on asking is, what problem does cryptocurrency solve? What is it that you can do with cryptocurrency that you can't do with lower transactions costs some other way? And after hours, have never gotten an answer to that. And you actually, when you try to get people to talk about concrete uses of cryptocurrency, they almost always involve some kind of tax evasion, or in some cases in developing countries that have exchange controls and bypassing the exchange controls or something like that. So, but it's almost always about one way or another avoiding government regulation rather than serving any fundamental economic need. I mean, it's not as if we lack ways of making electronic transfers of funds without cryptocurrency. We do that all the time. I mean, my daughter was amazed to see me actually writing a check, because at that age, everybody just uses Venmo or something like that. But it's unclear at all what cryptocurrency solves. And if you look at the actual use cases of cryptocurrency right now, it's dominated by illegal transactions. Sorry, it's still true. There's really not very much use of cryptocurrency outside that. Now, rather oddly, the United States takes maybe a bit of a hit because the US is, in fact, the US currency supply is primarily $100 bills. The value of US currency in circulation is primarily $100 bills, and for which there is almost no legitimate use. And indirect inference suggests that the bulk of those $100 bills are held outside the United States, probably by people doing things that we would rather they weren't doing. And we could lose that business to cryptocurrency. So basically, if the world's, if drug lords and all of that start using cryptocurrency, which they're already starting to, instead of bags full of $100 bills, then the U.S. loses some seigniorage. But the U.S. is such a big economy that the revenue we get from printing $100 bills is really trivial, even though we kind of dominate that market. So no, I mean, and there is not a hint in anything that the actual role of money in its classic form as a medium of exchange and as a unit of account is being threatened by cryptocurrency. So I just don't see that. It's just sort of a non-issue. I guess El Salvador is trying to make cryptocurrency its Bitcoin its legal tender, and it'd be an interesting experiment to watch. But I wouldn't expect it to do great things.
Thanks, Professor. There are quite a few more questions, and I have quite a few myself, but I want to be respectful of your time. So, ladies and gentlemen, that's all we have time for. So let me thank my colleagues on the Strategic Multi-Layer Assessment team, Todd Veazey, Nicole Peterson, and Mariah Yeager. And of course, I always thank the National Defense University leadership for empowering us to succeed. Professor, thank you for sharing your insights and your thoughts on these issues to help us better understand the economic element of national power, which is something that is still, I think, not as well understood as some of the other aspects of military power.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you so much. Thank you all, ladies and gentlemen, for joining us. And until the next session of the INSS Strategic Multi-Layer Assessment Speaker Series, this is Michael McCloudrick signing off and begging you to be safe, be healthy, and stay in touch. Take care all. Thank you, Professor.